Today we're at the Fredericksburg Area Museum and Cultural Center, and this is the local history museum for the Fredericksburg region, and that includes the surrounding counties of Spotsylvania, Stafford, King George, and Caroline, as well as the city of Fredericksburg. The museum has several exhibits dealing with the history of Fredericksburg, but today we're going to really be focusing on an exhibit called Fredericksburg at War, and more specifically the portion of the exhibit that discusses the civilian experience of residents of Fredericksburg during the Civil War. The National Park Service sites really cover the battles very well, and so we decided to take a different approach with our Civil War exhibits here at the museum and focus on the civilian experience. The items that we have in our collection and on loan on display here in the exhibition, they range from pieces of architecture that were destroyed during the shelling in December of 1862. We also have furniture from homes that was damaged during the bombardment. We also have some more personal items, things that residents in town buried in their backyards, knowing that with the impending occupation of the Union forces in town, that things might be looted and stolen, and they were certainly right about that. We also have on display a wonderful diary by a woman in town named Jane Beale, and it's one of the best records not only in Fredericksburg of the civilian experience during the war, but probably in the Confederacy in general. It's a very vivid account of what it was like for a white resident here in Fredericksburg during both the occupation and the Battle of Fredericksburg in December. Jane Beale was originally Jane Howison, and she married a man quite a few years her senior. They had 7 children, but her husband died while she was pregnant with her youngest child. And she never remarried after he died. She kind of fended for herself. She started a school out of her home just down the street here, and she also took in boarders for extra money as well. She paid off her debts after her husband died by the sale of some of her estate. Jane Beale began this particular diary in the 1850s, early 1850s. It was somewhat sporadic, her writing in the 50s, just more about day-to-day activities and things going on in town. An interesting look of what life was like in the South in the 1850s for a fairly well-to-do white resident in town. We know from her diary that she was an avid churchgoer. We also know that she had a few slaves at least. And we know that she was a very attentive mother and very focused on her children and her family life. Very early in the occupation, in May of 1862, Jane Beale writes about the Union Army occupying and the disruption of slavery in Fredericksburg and in the region. And she writes, "The enemy tell the servants to demand wages. This policy may suit them, but it fixes upon us the incubus of supporting a race who were ordained of a high heaven to serve the white man, and it is only in that capacity they can be happy, useful, and respected. I love my servants. They are part of my family, and their happiness has been my care as well as that of my children. I can but hope that no evil influences will be brought to bear upon their minds, inducing them to place themselves and me in a more unhappy position than which we now occupy." 2 of her slaves left during the occupation, near the end of the occupation, and they actually left for a short while, and then they returned. In her diary, she writes, "The first thing I heard this morning was that my 2 servants, Martha and Susan, had returned and requested permission to engage in their usual work. I went out feeling a good deal of indignation against them, but they seemed so humble and professed such penitence for having ever thought of going that I could only tell them that if they were willing to go to work again and content themselves in the condition in which God had placed them, I would say nothing more to them about ever having gone." And so you see this a lot when she comments on slavery, that it's the God-given role of slaves to be slaves. It was almost inevitable that Fredericksburg would become a pretty major battle site during the Civil War, given its location halfway between the capital of the Confederacy in Richmond and the capital of the United States in Washington, D.C. Jane Beale is almost maybe in a little bit of denial of what is about to happen. She chooses to believe some rumors that Lee wasn't interested in having the battle here at Fredericksburg, and so therefore she actually stays with her house and keeps her family here during the battle, which proved to be a very harrowing time for her and anyone else that stayed around town as well. Having something like Jane Beale's diary in the collection is incredibly important because it's really a first-hand account written more or less at the time that it happened of the experience of living in Fredericksburg during the Civil War and during the Battle of Fredericksburg.
I'm John Hennesy. I'm the chief historian at Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park, unit of the National Park Service. Standing here on the corner of Charles and William Street, where behind me is a block. It was put in originally as a carriage step in front of a hotel, but later this corner became a common place for the auction of slaves. You know, John Washington, the local slave, who grew up in this town, who never suffered physical punishment so far as we know, wrote often, though, about the trials of slavery. And the greatest of all the trials that he wrote about, and many other slaves wrote about, wasn't physical punishment, but the threat of separation, the threat of sale. And so an auction block like this, or a place of sale like this, represented the greatest nightmare for slaves. Fredericksburg, at the time of the Civil War, was a town of about 5,000 people. About a third of them were enslaved, and in the surrounding area, more than half of the local community of this community was enslaved. And it should be no surprise to anybody then that slaves saw this war differently than the white residents did. Whereas slaves like John Washington shared some of the fear of war that white Southerners had, they also, at least John Washington talks about this tremendous sense of anticipation, because he recognized that one of the outcomes of war would almost certainly be, if the Union were victorious, the end of slavery. And so for him, and for many other slaves, the war was a source of hope, was a vehicle for optimism. We're standing on the banks of the Rappahannock River, just about a mile above what was wartime Fredericksburg. John Washington took what he would have called his greatest journey that day. I don't think when he left his owner's house that he necessarily planned to cross to freedom. But when he got down to the river, he and two of his friends heard in the distance some Union bands playing. In fact, he said that we started to go up the stream to get opposite where the Union bands were playing touching tunes like the Star-Spangled Banner. And so John Washington and his two friends, including one of his cousins, started up the river and got to this point, looking for music ostensibly. They got to this point and they came down to the river's edge, right about where we're standing right now. And as they were standing here, there were Union soldiers on the far bank of the river, where the swimmers are today. And remember, at this point in the war, slavery was still new to Union soldiers. And so these Union soldiers saw these men on this side of the river and yelled across to them, "Hello, hello, do you want to come over?" John Washington said, yes, I want to come over. And so the soldiers actually sent a boat across. John Washington got in the boat and then talked his two friends into getting in with him. And so they paddled across the Rappahannock River at this point, and were immediately surrounded by Union soldiers. Now, John Washington was a very light-skinned man, and not everyone recognized that he was or could have been a slave at the time. So someone asked him, "Are you a slave?" He said, "I've been a slave all my life." And then someone said to him, "Do you want to be free?" And he said, undoubtedly with a great amount of feeling, "By all means," he said. A couple hours later, his friends decided to cross back over the river. One of them was a free black man, but John Washington decided to stay. And he later said, on reflecting, that this was the first night of my freedom. And he said, life had a new meaning awaiting me. And he said, of all the Fridays he had known up to that point, remember, this was Good Friday, this was the greatest Good Friday of all. When we do our history, we like to pick kind of our favored version of it. We like to assert the primacy of one idea or perspective over the other. And that's what America did for 130 years with its Civil War history. The default view of it was through the eyes of the people who wrote about it, who remembered it so more vividly in ways that we could consume today. And most of those people were, of course, white Southerners and white Northerners. When Americans talk about the Civil War, we tend to forget the payoff that came from this war. The payoff is a union, a nation that I think most of us love today, imperfect, but striving. And the payoff is freedom for 4 million Americans.